Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Derek Pratt. I'm the Director of Education and Public Programming here at the Erie Canal Museum in downtown Syracuse. All you folks who are from all over the country and world, stop by sometime. And thanks for joining us today virtually. The impact of the Erie Canal was immense, socially, economically, and politically. And one change its completion sparked was the construction of numerous other canals, resulting in thousands of miles of canals built throughout the United States. They all had similarities, but also no canal was the same. Each one has its own special and unique features. So today we're going to be looking at 4 of these canals from the Mid-Atlantic region, the Erie, the Delaware and Hudson, the Morris, and the Chesapeake and Ohio canals. This is our final lunchtime lecture of 2022, with this year's theme being infrastructure. This program was funded in part by Humanities New York, with support from the local endowment, from the National Endowment for the Humanities. We will still be having lunchtime lectures next year, with the theme being art along the Erie Canal. Our next lunchtime lecture is January 26th. That'll be both in person and virtual. That lecture will feature Syracuse University's Errol Willett, who will be discussing an innovative new piece of art currently on display here at the museum, a ceramic depiction of our historic 1850 Waylock, created through the use of robots. So if you want to learn more about this fascinating intersection of the ancient technology of canals with the new technologies of robots, tune in for that. The other big thing here at the Canal Museum is our 37th annual Gingerbread Gallery, which this year includes 40 incredible and edible gingerbread creations made by members of our community on display in storefront windows. That's open every day from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. with the exception of Christmas and New Year's. We also will be closing early at 2 p.m. Christmas Eve and New Year's. And that runs until January 8th. So book your flight from Stuttgart, Germany now. And we hope you can make it. Or come another December. Great time to be at the Erie Canal Museum. But anyway, now on to the main event. We've got 4 canalers here today on this panel. There's Bill Merchant, Deputy Director for Collections, Historian and Curator at the D&H Canal Historic Society, Kim Roth, Vice President of the Canal Society of New Jersey, and Rod Mackler, a board member with the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal Association. And finally, I will be representing the Erie Canal. I know we've got a lot of folks from each of those canal societies I've just mentioned. So thank you, especially for joining us today. Glad that we can all kind of integrate our various canal societies together. And also for those of you joining, a little on the format of how this is going to work. We'll be going from north to south in our canals here, and with each of our panelists taking between 7 and 10 minutes to discuss their canals. Then we'll have a discussion amongst ourselves regarding the similarities and differences we see in our canals. We're going to aim for each of us to kind of give about 1 minute in response to each other to keep things moving along. And then we'll do some general Q&As at the end. So if you do have a question, please put them in the chat and we'll do our best to get to it. So without further ado, I'll get started with the northernmost of these canals, the Erie. 1 second here. Oh boy. Sorry. One second. Nope, that's Rod's. My bad. There we go. Can everyone see that?
Yep.
All right, great. So the Erie Canal. I promise that will be the least efficient pulling up of a PowerPoint. Anyway, the Erie Canal is what I'll be talking about here. You can see the location of the Erie Canal Museum in a moment. We'll talk a little bit more about that. To understand the Erie, you kind of have to understand the geography of New York State. New York's unique. It's one of two states that borders both the Great Lakes and the Atlantic Ocean, the other being Pennsylvania, or at least it has access to both. And running all the way from Georgia up into Canada are the Appalachian Mountains. This is a map of New York, by the way, from 1809. Dividing or passing through the Appalachians, there's the Hudson River, which goes all the way down to New York City. And then right here is the Mohawk River, which cuts through the Appalachians, these two rivers, really the only place between Georgia and Maine under 500 feet elevation. So it's an ideal spot for a canal. And this is what they end up building between 1817 and 1825, the Erie Canal from Buffalo on Lake Erie to Albany on the Hudson River. And that's 363 miles long. It overcomes a 571 foot change in elevation over those 363 miles. And it did that through an almost entirely artificial waterway, utilizing 83 lift locks on the original canal. There will be 3 different sort of versions of the Erie though. And this work was undertaken by New York State itself, which spent a little over $7 million on the project. And I bring up these stats because I think they're going to be kind of important in a lot of what I just said here in kind of our comparisons with other canals as well. One important feature from the Erie Canal in its 8 years that it's built, it's often called the birthplace of American civil engineering. At the time in 1817, when we start digging it, there's no formalized school of civil engineering in the United States. And it's largely locals who are forced to come up with how to build a canal. And we can see a few of the more impressive bits of engineering that these early canal engineers had to make. This is the Richmond Aqueduct over the Seneca River, which is the second longest, though I will note this is the second version of it, built in the 1850s, I believe. And also one of the great, really fascinating bits of engineering, a marvel at the time, was the flight of 5 locks in Lockport. So these are 5 locks stacked on top of each other, overcoming about 60 feet in elevation, which is created by the Niagara Escarpment, which is the same cliff that Niagara Falls falls over, more or less. And they're a double combine lock. But also another really cool engineering feature, which I know at least some of us have really interesting ways that our canals overcame sort of inconvenient features of elevation, is this, the deep cut on the Erie, a several mile long man-made canyon that had to be dug at the top of that flight of 5 locks to reach the level of Lake Erie. Here's what it looked like afterward. And here are some of the engineers who got their start on the Erie. You've got the man generally called, officially recognized as the father of American civil engineering, Benjamin Wright, but also James Geddes, Candace White, Nathan Roberts, and John B. Jervis, who I think are going to play roles in most of the rest of our canals. The engineering core of the Erie Canal really become the premier civil engineers of the next 25 years, kind of American civil engineering history. So again, here's what they built. And the Erie Canal is a tremendous success economically. And it's another nickname of it is the mother of cities. You can see forming along its banks, Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, Rome, Utica, Albany, and all of these branch canals that go off of it as well to connect to other waterways as well as Lake Erie. And each of these places has diversified economies. This is Syracuse around 1900. So 1820, when the canal first goes through Syracuse, 250 people live in Syracuse. By the end of the century, 100,000 people do. And this is the heart of Syracuse. The city kind of radiates out from its city center here on the canal. And like I said, each city kind of diversifies its economy, and a lot of them have different goods that are their primary product that they ship. Syracuse is the salt city. You can see down here the massive salt fields of Syracuse, producing about 80% of the nation's salt at one point. Rochester, for instance, becomes the flour city, milling, I think something around 70% of the nation's grain at one point. Here's the Erie, so you can see right down the heart of Syracuse. There's also the Oswego Canal here, which connects Lake Ontario to the Erie Canal. And the confluence of those two leads me to another kind of unique bit of canal architecture, which is right here at that intersection. That's this building where I'm currently sitting, the Syracuse Waylock, one of 7 such waylocks. These were essentially toll booths on the canal. It's how they paid for the canal. Works the same way as a lock. You bring your boat into this chamber, they drain it out, and there's a giant scale apparatus that weighs your boat, and they assess the toll on that. I haven't dug too deeply, but I have yet to really find another non-New York State canal system canal that had a waylock on it. But again, I've only really scratched the surface of that question. Another unique thing about the Erie Canal is a lot of canals are going to get outcompeted by railroads and are closed and abandoned. The Erie, however, is the rare kind of 19th century canal that survives up to the present. And that's because at the turn of the 20th century, the barge canal system was constructed. So a whole new canal system was built, even larger than the previous 2 versions, using a lot of natural waterways as well as artificial channels. And they were able to coexist side by side with railroads and cars, as you can see in this picture. Where was I going with that? And it remains commercially viable into the 1960s when the St. Lawrence Seaway really starts taking away shipping traffic on it. And here is the New York State canal system today. And the canal still remains a vibrant place. We've got a lot of cycling on it, a lot of recreational activities. We're currently celebrating the bicentennial, and we have plans to revitalize the canal even more in historic bits. This is a planned pocket neighborhood around it. But I hopefully did not go over my time. Now we will move on to Bill, I believe.
If you're going geographically.
Yes, exactly. And,
You want to go into presentation, or shall we take it from?
We've got it.
There we go.
There you go. Take it away.
Beautiful E.L. Henry painting. Opening slide. I want to thank Derek and the Erie Canal Museum for hosting this. I've been wanting to do something like this for years. You can get me the next slide, Derek. I'm going to see if I can get under my 7 minutes. We'll see. I like context as a historian. The War of 1812 created an energy crisis in America, and the D&H Canal was one of many canals that were built to meet that crisis. We were buying coal from across the ocean or shipping it from Virginia on the Atlantic Ocean. The War of 1812 put a stop to that. But 3/4 of all the world's anthracite coal is in northeastern Pennsylvania. The D&H Canal Company was formed to exploit that resource. It was a coal company, unlike the Erie. and it was a private enterprise. And these are the brothers that initially, no, that was okay, Eric. I told you if I was going too slow, and you know, these are the three of the four Works brothers that were the progenitors of the D&H Canal. Without the D&H canals, without these gentlemen, excuse me, we would not have had the D&H Canal. Morris in particular, but William was credited with doing a lot of the early exploration, and John was their third president, but their first successful president. I can do the next slide now, huh? This is the Cliff Notes version. People, if you know, I can do an hour and 45 on this topic too. And I thought this was important. In fact, I did a version of this talk for the Erie Canal Museum. Oh no, it was for Schoharie Crossings, where I related the Erie Canal. This is a slide from that. Here are four gentlemen that came over to the D&H Canal, having first worked on the Erie Canal. James Archibald, John B. Jervis, and James Mackenzie. And as Eric told you, this was a training ground. We had West Point opens under the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, but they're really doing military engineering. RPI, Rensselaer Institute, opens in 1823, kind of too late to train our folks. In fact, the first civil engineering degrees in America aren't given until the 1840s by both RPI and Union. They both claim the credit, and I'm not going to bother figuring out who had it first. Maybe it was the same year. I can do the next slide then, Derek. And this is an early map of the D&H Canal. And I think it's important to note that this was like so many, and I'll be curious to see how my colleagues line up on this one. But this was, I can say definitively, this could not have been built nor operated without immigrant labor. But in fact, it relied heavily on immigrants, women, children, and people of color. They were the majority of the low-end workers, the mule drivers, the hoagies. They did the construction, they operated the boats. This is, like so many enterprises, one that relied on these more marginalized people. And I've written an article on that. If anybody ever wants to reach out, I'm happy to share it. Next slide. Trying to keep my ads to a minimum. So the D&H Canal Company was one of the private. In fact, I believe 3/4 of all the canals in America. There were over 100 canals built in this era of canal fever, and 3/4 of them were built with private money. But the D&H has the distinction, although there's another canal that might also have done it. But we like to say that we were the first $1 million private enterprise in American history. They raise, they don't actually raise the money, they get 5% down. But they raise, they subscribe, I should say, there's the way to put it, $1,500,000 worth of stock by 2 o'clock when they opened their stock books at the Tontine Coffee House. They also sold in banks in Kingston and Goshen, but this quickly becomes a New York City enterprise. It becomes their market. The Wirtz brothers were Philadelphia dry good merchants, and they originally brought their coal to Philadelphia, but they couldn't compete with Schuylkill and Lehigh. We won't have any of those folks with us today. But yeah, so it's one of those things that we like to fight. But I'm going to go America's first $1 million private enterprise. That would be $30 to $40 million in today's buying power. Next slide, then. And this is what the final canal. It was 108 locks with 20 aqueducts, 168 bridges, 84 waste weirs, 24 guard gates, and I won't even do the number of basins. And you can see it ran from I don't have a pointer here. It ran from Honesdale, Pennsylvania, along the Lackawaxen River to the Delaware River, where it crossed originally with a rope ferry, later with John Roebling's suspension aqueduct. Followed the Delaware River, followed the Neversink River, the Bashakill, the Sandberg, hits the Roundout in Ellenville, and then finally follows the Roundout Creek to the Hudson River. It's still 80 miles from its intended market of New York City, and yet this was the most efficacious. This was basically Benjamin Wright. Well, they hire him to do the survey, but he sends other guys because he's already so sought after. He is truly the father of American civil engineering. As such, he had his finger in a lot of. That'll be a curious question for the rest of this panel too. Hey, did Judge Wright work for you guys too? And he brought along those other gentlemen like John Jervis, who becomes the second chief engineer in 1826. I mean, they start digging it in 25. Wright is gone by 26. But he's the one that lays out this route. You build your canal and river valleys, as Derek sort of pointed out. A river valley is going to give you. It'll give you the most opportunity find a level. You want to minimize locks. So the Erie was 385 miles, 363 miles, 83 locks. The D&H was 108 miles. It had originally 110 locks. After its final enlargement in 1850, it was down to 108 locks. The other reason you followed a river valley was because you would capture water from it. As you locked down, they would build dams and little feeders, and they'd save that water. This was all, I believe all of our canals were all gravity fed. I like to say anytime there was water higher in that canal, they figured out a way to get it in that canal. My next slide, please. And this is just a great picture. This is the kind of locks we had throughout. This is a composite lock. You can see it's lined with white oak. So these were cheaper to build than cut stone masonry. There was some 6 or 7 cut stone masonry, most of them later. I'm still getting those numbers. I'm still out in the field discovering that I just discovered a month ago that Lock 22 was built in cut stone masonry. It's adjacent to stone quarries. So yes, somebody's mentioning waylocks. There were 2 waylocks in the D&H made by the Fairchild Scale Company of Vermont in 1850. There was one in New York State at Lock 1 in Eddyville, and the other one was in Pennsylvania. So there's another one. That's 2 now, right? The Lehigh, I noticed Daphne. So the waylocks, I was told, Eric, that the original locks on the Erie were displacement locks, but people didn't trust them and they had to go over to mechanical locks. I'm curious to know, the science of displacement confuses some people. But this is just a wonderful image. I would note in the back, you see that bridge. That's a Squire Whipple Bridge, designed for the Erie Canal. He was one of the earliest graduates of Union College's civil engineering, and he designed these. So we have images of these early wooden pony truss bridges, and then in the latter period, they get replaced when they worn out with these iron truss bridges that you see in the background there. My next slide. The D&H had a gravity railroad. They had a problem. Their mines were in a town that, and I love how they named things back in the day, Carbondale. I wonder what made them think of that. Carbondale, Pennsylvania. They had 850 foot of Moosic Mountain to get over. It was just too high. They posited a couple different things, but in the end, John Jervis designs what is the first gravity railroad there. And that's another thing I'd love to chase down. I know there was a second one from the Pennsylvania Coal Company that connected to the D&H in the 1840s. But the D&H were the first one. They built the first gravity railroad. It's called a gravity railroad because the cars were connected, and the weight of the laden cars descending would pull the light cars up. That's a little deceiving because they also use steam power, mule power, and water power. It also, like so many things, it was enlarged and they improved it as they went along, and so it became more and more gravity fed, more efficient in the 4 to 5 iterations. My colleague, Dr. Robert Powell, could really speak to this. He runs the Carbondale Historical Society. The D&H, they run. I think this is fascinating because we're in the canal era, and yet already locomotives, they're gonna overtake. The D&H Canal Company runs the first steam locomotive ever run on tracks in the Western Hemisphere, the Starbridge Line. Unfortunately, it only runs for 2 test runs. It winded up that it was too heavy for the tracks. John Jervis designed, so this is before the I-rail. And we don't have very good metal making. We're buying our metal from England at this point too. The original gravity railroad was hemlock stringers with 1/2 inch by 2 inch iron strapping nailed to it, and then these rail cars ran on that. And it was designed to say that it was designed to carry 5,000 tons, and indeed the cars carried 4,000. Each car would carry 4,000 tons of coal, and the car was probably another 1,000 tons. I like to say that it's my supposition that the reason why the Lion was unsuccessful, I like to say it weighed 5 tons in Starbridge, but it weighed 7 tons in Honesdale. It's because we had different measurements. They had the imperial system. And I've done the math. They've changed since that era, but in fact, 5 imperial tons in 1829 were 7 American tons. Interestingly enough, that genius John Roebling, whenever he and his correspondents wrote a ton, he told you how many pounds in parentheses because he knew. And that's my best guess. It's now recently been published. I've heard a lot of hooey, but this is my, and this has happened with the space program, but Derek's moved my slide, which is his way of keeping me moving. This I'm going to be curious to ask my colleagues. We had a unique semi-patented system because, boy, lock tenders made between $30 and $40 a month, and you needed two of them to operate the miter gates. The Canal Company between 53 and 57 changes all 108 locks to this system so that one person, so that they can lay off or repurpose 108 lock tenders. And I understand other canals use different methods, but everybody was thinking of saving that money. Next slide there, Derek. Just a great photo by the 1870s when pressure from railroads drops what they're paying the canalers. They still have more than they're turning away workers. Family groups start to predominate, and this is the de Groot family. The other interesting thing, this is one of 4 suspension aqueducts that John Roebling designed for the D&H Canal Company, and I have 8 photographs taken in this spot. This became a spot for maybe Hawley's Ludolf Hensel, I speculate, but somebody used to go there and you could get a photo taken, and 10 days later he'd bring you a print, presumably. But it's also that, just to bring up this technology, Rosendale Cement, discovered when they were digging the canal, huge industry in and of itself. I'm working on a book on the D&H Canal, but I'm also now working on a history of Rosendale Cement. Fascinating topic. More than half of North America's cement in the second half of the 19th century was Rosendale Cement, mostly transported on the D&H Canal. Indeed, when the coal company abandons the canal in 1898, it becomes a cement canal until 1917, and it just operates to service this industry. This was discovered by a geologist. Similar thing happened on the Erie. Canvas White discovers dolomitic limestone in Chittenango. The canal company was aware of that. That's why they had a geologist travel with the group. Next slide. I didn't look at what time I started. And as I said, they were a coal company. By 1872, the year that they move almost 1.5 million tons of coal, the most coal they ever move in the canal, they own or control railroads from New York to Montreal. Really smart of them. Get that coal up to cold Canada. Plus, my canal operated from April till November. So you were, at the time when you need the coal, the canal was not operating. But they were a railroad until the 1990s, and there we go. Thank you so much, and it's on to the next one.
All right, thank you, Bill. Thank you as well, everyone, to talking about whale locks and stuff in the chat. Good to know about that. Next up, we've got Tim and the Morris Canal. Let me just bring up your PowerPoint here. It's coming. All right, there we go.
There we go. Okay, thank you, Derek. The Canal Society in New Jersey is actually responsible for both New Jersey canals, which are the Delaware and Raritan, which goes across central New Jersey, and the Morris Canal, which went across northern New Jersey. The Morris Canal generally gets the more interest because it's no longer there, it's abandoned, but also because of what it did. It was known as the Mountain Climbing Canal. Next slide, Derek. So it started in 1822, so exactly 200 years ago. And this will probably be the last presentation where I can say it was exactly 200 years ago. But 1822, Morristown businessman George McCullough, very wealthy businessman, was fishing on Lake Opakon, legend has it, and he came up with the idea of using the headwaters of Lake Opakon to build a canal across northern New Jersey. Now we had this kind of long-winded 19th century quote from him. What he's basically saying is, Pennsylvania, we had these huge supplies of anthracite coal, and by coming up with a way to bring them across the state to towns in the east, like Newark, Elizabeth, and even New York City, would solve the problem of either continuing to use wood, which was becoming depleted. Bill mentioned the energy crisis, or to use Liverpool coal, meaning ship it across from England. So what's interesting here is what is not mentioned as an option at all is bringing them over by road. Because in 1822, it was actually easier and more efficient to bring coal all the way across the Atlantic Ocean from Europe than it was to simply truck it from road from Pennsylvania to New Jersey. So that seems inconceivable today, but that is what drove the need for these canals in the early 19th century. Next slide, there. So to finance this, Mr. McCullough wanted to stay in New Jersey. State wanted nothing to do with it. So it was a private company that was formed called the Morris Canal and Banking Company, and stocks were sold to create $2 million of capital, which did fund the building of the canal. Today, probably only fund the plans, but it was enough money back then. Interestingly, this caused Mr. McCullough to disassociate himself with it, because many wealthy people back then did not like banks. They did not trust banks. They thought they were evil. So he wanted his name not associated at all with something called a banking company. So this ended up being a smart financial move, because the Morris Canal Banking Company was not a financial success, except for a few years in the 1860s. It operated operated on a loss. So even though George McCullough was considered the father of the Morris Canal, he was only involved in the very beginning. Next slide, please. So on November 4th, 1831, the first trip was made. At that point, the canal only went from the Delaware River to Newark. It took another 5 years to complete it to Jersey City, connecting the Delaware and the Hudson River. And if you look over on the right side of the screen, you see that big elbow there between Newark and Jersey City. And that was because of the Palisades. Now, you probably know the Palisades cliff along the Hudson River. It actually extends underground south. So they're digging across between Newark and Jersey City. They hit this wall, and they had to dig all the way down to the northern part of Bayonne to get it around it and make it up to Jersey City. So back then, there was no way, there was no dynamite or anything like that. You hit a ledge like that, you had to find your way around it. So in 1836, now you connected the Delaware River to the Hudson River, and this created this system of canals. Next slide, please. And this was the New Jersey, Pennsylvania system. And if you look up at the upper left, you see the Lehigh Canal, which serviced Marchunk, which today we know as Jim Thorpe. That was a big coal producing area. There was a gravity railroad that took the canal, took the coal down to Marchunk. And then to get it down to New Jersey, you had to take Lehigh Navigation Canal, which would take you to, back again, thank you, to Easton. And if you're going over to New York, you would take the Morris Canal across. If you're going down to Trenton or New Brunswick, you would take the Delaware Division Canal down and then jump across the DNR, and that would take you over to New Brunswick and Raritan Bay. So this was part of this whole highway of canals. Now, interestingly, a couple of years ago, we did a newsletter article where someone wanted to transport coal from Marchunk up to Elmira. Today, that's like a 2-hour drive. Back then, you had to go down Lehigh, across the Morris, up the Hudson River to the Erie, over to, I forget where, but down the Chemung Canal, and then to Binghamton, and then over to Elmira. That took a month of travel for what is today a 2-hour drive. Next slide, please. So the big challenge with the Morris Canal was the New Jersey Highlands. A lot of people outside of New Jersey may not know that the Appalachian Mountains go through northwest part of New Jersey, making it very mountainous. And Mr. McCullough's estimate was way off. He had 300 feet guessed as an elevation, was actually 1,674 feet. So how do we overcome these elevations? Next slide. So the Morris Canal did use locks, 23 lift locks, 9 guard locks. Use a couple of photos. And the upper one shows a Morris Canal boat in the lock. And you can see it was a very tight fit. These locks were designed specifically for Morris Canal cargo boats. They were 91 feet by 10.5 feet wide. The canals were 95 feet by 11 feet. So very tight fit. And because of this, once the cargo traffic dried up by boats rather, the canal became obsolete. So it only lasted until the early part of the 20th century. The DNR, by comparison, was a much bigger canal, had bigger locks, so it lasted into the 1930s. So these are the two best locks to see on the Morris Canal. The Wharton Canal has been totally restored, so it looks just like you see it there. Now the tender's house is being restored. And the one at the bottom, the guard lock at Waterloo, that's the one Morris Canal Village. And what you see in that photo pretty much it still exists. The lock, the canal, and the lock store there. So these are two good ones to visit if you come to New Jersey. Next slide, please. So locks were good for overcoming 10, 15 feet of elevation. What if you had big changes in elevation that would exist going across the highlands? You do this, and Derek mentioned Lockport and the flight of 5 locks there, but going across northern New Jersey, you would need much bigger flights. And this is one in England. It's called the Cannon Hill locks at the Cannon-David Canal. 29 locks, takes 5 hours to go through. So that's the problem with lock flights. Takes a lot of time. So with all these big elevation changes going across New Jersey, it would add too much time to the trip, would not be efficient. So they had to come up with another method. Next slide, please. And the solution was the use of inclined planes. The Morris Canal was the first place it was used, and it was the only canal in the United States that used inclined planes. If you look at the upper right, you see the original design, which used big water wheels like a mill. And that was good for pulling like 20 tons. But once we got in the 1840s and the demand for coal really increased, they had to come up with a new design for inclined planes. And they used this Scotch turbine method that you see in the middle diagram. And this was a huge turbine. You see it in the lower left. That's me standing in front of one. It would be 40 feet underground, and the huge power of water and gravity combined would turn that huge turbine, and that created the power to pull the boats up and down these inclined planes. Fully loaded, it could pull a boat over 100 tons now. And this was a design that lasted until the end. Next slide, please. So it's a couple photos, inclined planes. Top one is in Booton. We're just right now uncovering the sleeper stones. There are boats going into the cradle. It's about to be pulled up the plane. And lower one is kind of a captain's eye view looking down through the cradle, down the plane. This is actually an inspection boat. So the elevation change is 33 to 98 feet over 18 hours. It's saved in time. Next slide. So Morris Canal, of course, like all the other ones have come to the railroads. Here we see a photo of the canal next to the railroad. By the turn of the century, the cargo traffic had dried up. There weren't many cargo boats. So the canal was being used for other purposes like transporting passengers. Here we see from the rail station up to Lake Abacon in the various resorts. But the canal was officially abandoned and mostly filled in by 1924. Next slide, please. So if you come to New Jersey and you want to visit this, there are a few inclined planes. You can see this. The top one is in Ledgewood, a very good inclined plane, well preserved. You can see the sleeper stones and the bypass channel, and the white structure is the turbine chamber. Or plane 9 West in Stewartsville, where we actually do tours into the inclined plane second Sunday of the month, April through October. Next slide. If you want to actually ride an inclined plane, you can't do that anywhere in the United States. You'd have to go to Poland, where the Elbe Canal still operates, and they do rides on that. And the gentleman who's in charge of this canal came to New Jersey a few years ago because he wanted to see the birthplace, did a trip all the way across New Jersey, seeing every single inclined plane site. Didn't speak a word of English, and so when the police were called several times, he had to kind of muddle his way through it. So next slide. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you. Thank you to Derek. Here's my contact information. If you have any questions, if you want to come to New Jersey and see some sites, let me know. I'll help you out. And there's our website and our Facebook page. So thank you. I'll turn it back to you, Derek.
Thanks, Tim. Appreciate it. And now, last but not least, we've got the C&O Canal, and Ron will be talking about that. Just bringing that slideshow up. All right, I think we're good to go here.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Thanks to Derek and the Erie Canal Museum for setting up this panel, to Derek, Bill, and Tim for their excellent presentations, and to you people out in Zoom land who are participating with us. The Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, the goal of the canal, as its name implies, was to connect the Chesapeake Bay at Washington, D.C. to the Ohio River watershed. Next. What they actually got was a canal 184.5 miles long from Washington, D.C. at the lower right at sea level to Cumberland, Maryland, which is about 600 feet in altitude. The C&O Canal was begun on July 4, 1828, when President John Quincy Adams turned the first spade for the canal. It was completed in 1850 when it reached Cumberland, 184.5 miles up the Potomac River, about half the length of the Erie Canal and about the same elevation difference. The canal operated until 1924 when floods damaged it beyond repair. Next. The canal has 74 locks. Next. 11 aqueducts. Next. Over 200 culverts. Next. And 1 tunnel. Although the canal has not operated for nearly a century, most of these features are intact and can be seen today. Let me focus on these structures. Infrastructure, as the title of this whole lecture goes, they're beautiful and substantial works of masonry. Next. This is lock number 3 in the Georgetown section of the District of Columbia. Like most of the locks on the canal, it's about 15 feet wide, 90 feet long, and has a lift of about 8 feet. Most of the locks, like this one, have miter gates, though there were a few where the miters were replaced by drop gates. Next. This is the Monocacy Aqueduct, the longest of the 11 on the canal. It has 7 arches and spans the largest tributary on the Maryland side of the Potomac. Chief Engineer Benjamin Wright, we heard that name before, drew up the plans for this aqueduct. During the Civil War, the aqueduct withstood several attempts by the Confederates to blow it up. Next. Calvert 82 over Little Catoctin Creek is distinguished by the fact that it is now missing. It washed out in a flood in May of 2018. The culverts were built under the canal to prevent the passage of water or vehicles. Next. And the tunnel, the Pawpaw Tunnel, took 14 long years to complete, from 1836 until 1850. It was held up by labor troubles, construction delays, and financial woes. Over half a mile long, it avoids 6 miles of Potomac River bends. Note that the width at 25 feet or 24 feet was not wide enough for 2 15-foot boats to pass. Laden boats coming downstream had right of way, but there were few frequent tussles over that right. The impetus for building the canal was spurred in part by the example of the Erie Canal, completed in 1825, that showed a canal could be profitable. As Derek said, that success touched off the canal mania in the United States. Next. Again, the familiar picture of Benjamin Wright. He worked his way up from surveyor to engineer on the Erie Canal. He then parlayed that experience into work as an engineer on the Chesapeake and Delaware and the Delaware and Hudson. For the C&O, Wright was hired at the outset in 1828 as chief engineer. Within a year, he had let contract for construction involving 6,000 men and 700 horses. Next. The C&O Canal was not the first effort to make the Potomac Valley navigable. The Potomac Company was founded in 1785 with George Washington as its president. The Potomac Canal was a series of 5 skirting canals around the roughest parts of the river and dredging for other obstructions. From lower right to left, the 5 skirting canals were at Little Falls, Great Falls, Seneca Falls, Payne Falls, and House Falls. This extended the navigation season somewhat, but it became clear that a ditch parallel to the river would considerably increase the season. and certainly improve commerce in an upstream direction. In fact, the spot where President Adams broke ground for the C&O Canal was at the end of the Little Falls Skirting Canal, there in the lower right, at the fall line of the Potomac, the boundary between the coastal plain and the Piedmont. George Washington and other Virginians felt the Potomac route was superior to a New York or Pennsylvania canal because A, it is shorter, and B, it would have a longer season unblocked by the ice that would shorten the season further north. They glossed over, however, the fact that it would need to cross the Appalachians, as Derek pointed out, at nearly 2,000 feet. That would require quite a few more locks than the 74 needed to reach Cumberland at 600 feet, and would also require reliable sources of water at higher elevations. Next. One difference between the C&O Canal and the other canals being considered today, that the C&O was not a summit canal. That is, as completed, it did not go up the hill and down the other side. It is all downhill from Cumberland to Washington. It is parallel to the Potomac River and is watered only through inlet channels from the river. There are no reservoirs. One impetus for the canal was economic, of course, but there was also a political rationale. Washington, in particular, who had traveled, surveyed, and fought beyond the Eastern Continental Divide, was sensitive to the needs of the settlers beyond the Appalachian Mountains. He had been there. He felt that there were threats to the unity of the new nation beyond the mountains. The English in Canada, the French in the Mississippi Valley, and the Spanish in New Orleans in the Southwest. A canal from the interior valleys to the eastern seaboard would serve to tie together those areas. In short, Washington believed that the better transportation and trade would draw lands west of the Allegheny Mountains into the United States and, quote, bind those people to us by a chain that can never be broken, end quote. Cargo. The Erie, as we discussed, had a great variety of human and commodity freight. But the C&O, like the Delaware and Hudson, the Morris, and the Delaware and Raritan, had one main purpose, carrying bulk coal from the seams under the mountain to the cities at the tidewater, to feed their industries, heat their homes, and increasingly to sate the voracious appetites of steamships. Supplying the ships of the U.S. Navy in the Chesapeake Bay kept the C&O Canal operating through World War I. But increasingly, like most of the nation's canals, the C&O lost traffic to the railroads, specifically in this case to the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. The B&O was started on the same day, July 4, 1828, as the C&O Canal, and it reached the Ohio River at Wheeling in 1853. As I said, the C&O Canal ceased operation in 1924. Parts of the canal were restored by the CCC in the late 1930s. There were proposals to convert much of the right-of-way into a parkway in the 1950s, but these were forestalled. President Eisenhower declared it a national monument as he went out the door in 1961. And a decade later, Congress made the canal a National Historical Park, an act signed into law by President Nixon in January of 1971. Today, the prime attraction is the towpath, a 184.5-mile bike and pedestrian path from Cumberland to Washington, interrupted only by the occasional washout or construction project. The completion of the Great Allegheny Passage Rail Trail to Pittsburgh in 2013 adds another 150 miles to this recreational treasure. But in a sense, Cumberland was not the end of the line for this connection to the West. The first federally funded infrastructure project, the National Road, was built between 1811 and 1837. It extended the route from Maryland to Wheeling, then into Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. Eventually, it became US 40 and Interstate 70 from coast to coast. But that's a story for another day. Next. Thank you.
You're on mute, Derek.
Sorry. Thanks a lot, Rod. I added this slide here at the end just to kind of bring all of our talks together. This is showing all of the canals, or at least most of them, that existed in the United States at times. All of our canals are on here. And now we get to talk about it. I think we've got a lot of similarities here, but also I think some really interesting differences. So remember, so we all ran long. I'm not surprised. Us canalers all enjoyed to talk about our canals. I know, but in the interest of time, and so we can get to some questions from the audience. Remember to we'll try to aim for 1 minute long responses from each of us. Well, I don't know. Was there anything anybody found particularly interesting that we think would make a good discussion?
Well, I found two things very interesting that I didn't know about. The DNH, 110 locks. It had basically 1 lock per mile, which is a lot of locks. And then with the CNO, that it watered 184 miles without any kind of reservoirs, just rivers, natural. I assume natural rivers and streams. Those two things struck me as being very interesting.
Yeah,
The DNH had to go over about 1,000 foot, so that explains that.
Oh yeah,
it was a greater elevation, and it was going up and down. As Rod told us, he just went all one direction. I'm fascinated that the DNH had over 25 reservoirs to water. I mean, they're far flung. Sometimes they needed water. They had issues when they didn't have water. So yeah,
I found that pretty impressive about the CNO too. That there were no reservoirs. Even the Erie had a lot. Like we saw, like the Erie wasn't overcoming kind of the really crazy elevation some of you guys were, but we still needed like a ton of reservoirs, especially as they expanded it. And we all seem to have really interesting and unique ways to kind of overcome these changes in elevation. The Morris had their inclined planes. Bill, you guys invented railroads almost. Yeah, and the Paw Paw Tunnel down in Maryland is fascinating. I got to go through it. It was also horrifying.
Dark and cold and wet.
Yes. It was hot when I went through, which made it worse. I thought. But the other interesting thing I found, I didn't realize that the Morris Canal was a privately funded canal too. Rod, was the CNO public or private?
There were no federal funds until the national road, and that was very much an outlier. The CNO was funded mostly by the states of Maryland and Virginia, with subscription of private stock as well, but no federal funds.
I'm working on a book on the DNH, and of course I'm starting at the beginning. And one source, I think it's Drago, says that 3/4 of all the over 100 American canals, 3/4 were private money, which I thought it was more state money than that. And in total, over $1 billion was expended on canals in the 19th century. So the equivalent today is just staggering. My $1.5 million, and it does seem like the Morris was in ahead of us a little there with the first million. We'll duke it out sometime. Who was the first $1 million private enterprise? Some people take issue with the private enterprise thing because the DNH took the state of New York actually gave them a $500,000 bond issue. They raised $1.5 million. In the end, it cost closer to $2 million to build, including the Gravity Railroad. And I get a kick out of it. They were running out of money in 1827. They're watered and operating from the Hudson down to Port Jervis. They've done nothing in Pennsylvania. They're afraid people are going to rip them off, going to gouge them. And they get a $500,000 bond issue from the state of New York. That money funds digging the canal in Pennsylvania. But they needed each other.
Right. And we actually just, David Brooks, he brought up some interesting points about our funding for sources. Rod, you brought up the national road, how this is all kind of a, whatchamacallit, all of our canals, the various ways they got built and whatnot. And David talks about the Potomac as well. We had the Western Inland, which tried to be a private company too, and just kind of what Bill was alluding to, these intersectional kind of rivalries between states and also like constitutional scruples at the time about whether the federal government could even fund these projects. I do also find it interesting though, Rod, that your Virginia and Maryland area ones do get some federal funding with the national road, but
No, President Jefferson was very much opposed to spending money for infrastructure, considered it unconstitutional.
He's a man with a lot of cognitive dissonance. He writes all men are created equal. He enslaves 180 people at his peak. He says we should be a small country. He buys Louisiana, which isn't just a little state. It was like a quarter of the continent, right? If not more. And he said it would be, well, they quote, approach as sheer madness or something. Actually, it's more complicated because DeWitt Clinton goes to him to fund this is in the 1800s now, 15 years before it happens, to fund the Erie. And the story is he was initially enthusiastic, but then he said, "Oh, we don't have the, it's going to be too expensive. We don't have the brain trust." A man with too much cognitive dissonance.
fair enough. We could make entire series on Thomas Jefferson, I'm sure. Yeah. So another interesting thing I found was every kind of the end of all of our stories, they all take pretty interesting turns. I found that really fascinating, Rod, that C&O was still supplying naval ships into the World War I. Bill, like having a private corporation gave D&H seemingly enough kind of flexibility that they were able to invest in railroads. Tim, yours like transitioning from coal to pleasure boating. And then we've got the Erie, which they just built a whole new canal, which I think kind of the success of the Erie and the fact that it wasn't just hauling coal probably really kind of allowed the state to be able to come in and say like, hey, you still need to build a canal. I don't think that would have been feasible anywhere else in America.
It's still carrying very big things. A couple summers ago, we could have gone out and watched on the Hudson a giant turbine that GE made somewhere that came across the Erie, as I understand, is largely the Mohawk River. They've basically they've gotten rid of the obstructions. In a way, they did what they started. My canal company, they started with permission to improve the navigation of the Lackawaxen River, but in the end, they built a canal. And now the Erie, on the other hand, the last man standing. Our three canals are recreational, if anything, but it turns around and does exactly what they started to do, only more efficiently because technologies have changed. I would posit, But I also think it's interesting that three out of the four were really just for the coal. I only recently learned that 3/4 of all the anthracites in northeastern Pennsylvania, that's a staggering statistic. That explains so much.
Rod, was the plan initially when they wanted to go to the Ohio, were they specifically going for coal, or was they had bigger plans than that?
It was partly economically, not just for coal, but other products, wheat, corn, whiskey, and things coming up or from overseas, finished goods and luxury goods to get to the West. And as I mentioned, the political rationale of connecting the West to the Eastern Seaboard. It was to have gone from Cumberland, perhaps to Pittsburgh, to look at your map there, or more likely to Wheeling, which is sort of almost due west of Cumberland there on the Ohio River.
Oh, all right. Well, so this has been a good conversation, I think. But we have hit the 1 o'clock mark, and I want to give some folks a chance to get some questions in. Are there any questions for any of our panelists about general canals or people-specific canal? The question of who is Hannah Lewis and how do I contact her? She is our curator here at the Erie Canals. That was our first question. Also, to go back to an earlier question in the chat, there was some about waylocks. Thank you, everyone, for commenting on them. I think it was the DNL that had waylocks as well. Someone asked how a hydrostatic waylock worked. They could drain out the water and determine how much water was displaced by the canal boat, and therefore you could tell how much it weighed. Canalers weren't reading up on their Archimedes too much, so I think they didn't trust it a lot.
We're told that when the first Roebling Aqueduct, the one that's still extant on the national park site now, over the Delaware River, that when the first boat went through, everybody came because they all thought it was going to fail, not realizing that the weight didn't change at all. You know, the boat came in, it displaced, at that point in time, the boats would have been carrying maybe 50 or 60 tons of coal. And it, you know, when it would have failed is when they let the water in. But apparently nobody was around for that. But people just don't understand the physics, clearly, you know.
Interesting. Yeah.
I also think it's interesting. I mean, although we were coal canals, and I think this is probably true, as Rod said, the D&H fostered many, many other industries. I mean, they're bringing rawhides up from South America and the Caribbean, up the Atlantic, up the Hudson River, out into Sullivan County, where they're then making leather and shipping it back out. There were immense other industries that benefited because we're talking about a transportation network going through what was basically wilderness.
Yeah. Another question popping up here. I'll kind of synthesize a couple. So I know I talked about our towpath and kind of the recreational activities on it. Rod, you mentioned how the CNO's towpath is connecting to the Gap Trail, and there's a lot of cycling and recreational opportunities. Bill or Tim, do your canals have kind of robust sort of cycling or pedestrian trails that people can visit, or what is there to do on everyone's canals, I guess, these days?
Well, I'll start if that's okay. So with two canals in New Jersey, the Morris and the DNR. The Morris Canal is abandoned, so it's very fragmented across the state where there are specific places you can go and see that site. But we do have some great hiking trails out there, places that are connected with the Morris Canal that are connected to other trails. And if you go to our website, canalsocietyNJ.org, we have a lot of walking tours of the Morris Canal. Now, as far as the DNR goes, that is still completely watered and completely intact. So if you want to get on your bicycle and ride for miles on a towpath, or get on your kayak and paddle for miles, the DNR would be the place to do that. And I do that all the time. I'm a big kayaker and cyclist, so I'm down at the DNR a lot. And they're only about an hour away from each other. So if you do a trip to New Jersey, you've got to see the best of both worlds.
And of course, there are the natural things to see as well, the flora and fauna, when you've got a difference from sea level to 600 feet. You've got quite a variety of different critters and plants that grow at those altitudes.
And on the D&H, to answer the question, Derek, I've been leading the field surveys working on the update to the National Register. The whole D&H Canal was put on the register in '68, but it was very perfunctory. We've located 411 extant features that will now be individually enumerated in the resource table. It's about, I'm going to say, 70% intact. It goes through how many counties? Goes through Pike and Wayne in Pennsylvania, goes through Orange, Sullivan, and Ulster. Orange and Sullivan counties in New York own the entire bed. Sullivan does a great job. 80%'s open and trails. Orange is kind of their population center is the other side of the Shawangums. They're kind of neglectful. But we are trying right now to get a national park trail on the entire D&H. It's doable. There's enough extent. There's an awful lot to see. A little plug for my museum. If you go to canalmuseum.org, I've got a story map, a Google map that shows you the entire route of the canal. There's now and then pictures. As we release video on D&H TV, our YouTube channel, my favorite thing is Where is Our Historian, where I go out into the field and show you what's there. So I link those in this Google map. But this Google map shows you all the publicly accessible trails on the D&H Canal. And I'd have to say maybe a third of it, I've never sat down to try and figure it out, is currently accessible if you know where to go. And if you want to know where to go, you can find out at our website.
Thanks, Bill. And I think that this all kind of leads well into, I think the question I'll close it out on, which I thought was a really interesting one. It actually got sent to me before the talk and got put in the chat as well. Question is, in the way that we have categories for preserving biological diversity and so forth, such as rare and endangered species, are there such categories for unique or rare infrastructures? And if so, are they classified? Which I think it's an interesting question. You can definitely, Bill, you just mentioned, get National Historic Landmark status.
But that doesn't do anything. That really doesn't protect it. The real shame in historic preservation, I'm also the chair of our local Historic Preservation Commission, it only protects the exteriors, if that. You can be on a National Register place today and destroy it. There's nothing to stop you. We need stronger laws.
Yep.
We protect wildlife as well. We should. I'm not saying we shouldn't. We protect wildlife better than our historic integrity. Americans are crazy about private property rights. If we had followed the indigenous people, nobody would own property. Hubris.
Sure.
Indian givers. The concept was foreign to them. The land was everybody's living. How could you own that? How could you? And yet what is in our modern world? We own our properties and we want to do whatever we can with them. And I think it's to the detriment of us as a society. And I think it's a shame, but it is what it is.
Sure. I know here in New York, for instance, we have some preservation societies. Western New York, I know they have a really good Western New York Preservation Society that has their 7 to Save list every year, where they fight to preserve buildings and different sites. And I think good plug for all of us. If you want to save and tell the stories of your local unique canal features, you should become members of your local canal societies and museums. Check out our website, volunteers. There's, as you can see from this map, there's a canal near you, probably, if you live in the northeast. I don't know, what are things like in New Jersey or Maryland?
I'm sorry, what's the question? I kind of
What's preservation like down there? Are there any?
Well, it's what Bill said, that the laws don't protect, are very limited. I mean, in a town of Booton where we just have this big construction site that destroyed a lot of historic features, and that's where we have an inclined plane there that's actually on town property, but right next to the site. And we're scared to death that they're going to infringe on that, even though it is public property. So we're up there putting stakes and doing everything, having meetings with the town council to protect it. But there is, when it's private property and a developer has a plan, you're very limited to what you can do.
And another factor is the cost. There are over 2,000 structures in the C&O Canal National Historical Park, but the park itself does not have the resources, the money, to maintain all those structures. And some of the more interesting structures on the canal are rotting away, or in some cases have even been bulldozed because the park could not maintain them.
The state of New York, when they buy properties or get gifted properties, they invariably take down historic structures. My state does it. You know, you would think, and it's all about resources. It's all about the expense, which again, you know, Derek, if you want to save what's there, canal societies like the ones all of us work for are trying to preserve them as much as we can. We own sections, my own organization. I'm getting ready to do the tax paperwork every year. We own 10 different properties that have got D&H remains on them.
I did also just remember one bit of thing that kind of saves New York's canals or saves at the moment. New York's canals are still owned by the state of New York, most of outside of the D&H. So, you know, like I said, the Erie Canal still functions. I know the Barge Canal just got National Historic Landmark status, and it's protected under the Constitution of the state of New York, which helps some parts of our the current operating bits and some of the historic parts. Like here in central New York, we have the old Erie Canal State Historic Park, which still serves as like an emergency feeder to the Barge Canal system. So it's still owned and operated by New York.
Yeah.
Doesn't the Empire State Trail basically follow the Erie from Albany to Buffalo? As I understand it, the state's put in $200 and some odd million on the Empire State Trail. You can get on a trail in New York City and go all the way to Montreal on rail trails. We're fortunate. Ulster County is the only county on this side of the river. They cross over at the walkway over the Hudson, then they cross back over at the Rhinebeck Bridge. But then, as I understand it, it extends largely on the Erie, which I think has the possibility of tying together the parts of the historic Erie that are still there. Recreation's going to save us, people, you know, to some degree.
But as we mentioned before, most of these canals follow river valleys, and rivers, especially in the spring, tend to flood, as my colleague Travis Metcalf said, and that can destroy a lot of the structures along the canal, or at least require very regular maintenance.
Now, Rod, I'd heard on the C&O Canal, you have a what's called, I believe, a canal quarters thing where lock tenders' houses are now used where people can stay overnight if they're bicycling along the towpath.
Yeah, precisely, Tim. The best way to maintain structures is to use them. That encourages people to put a good roof on a structure, and that's the key to preserving any of them. And there are 6 or 8 canal keepers' houses that are for rent along the C&O Canal. Canal quarters is the term, as you said. One can Google it and find out how to spend the night in a canal lock house, and then volunteers help maintain them, cut the grass, clean them, make sure that the linens are changed, and so on.
That's an excellent idea. It really is.
Use it and keep it.
Yeah, I think New York's actually investing in possibly trying to do that too, inspired by the C&O. So there's a lot we can learn from all of our canals, I think, both historically and for the present. And we're getting a lot of positive comments in the chat about the lock house as well. But with that, I think I'll wrap it up here. Oh, Bill, you got something else?
One more thing. The phrase hoagie. I read somewhere that hoagie was only used to refer to the mule drivers on the D&H and the Erie. But then I read somewhere else that James Garfield was a hoagie on the Ohio Canal. How prevalent is that phrase? It's my contention hoagie was for the 2 phrases that the mule driver said the most: ho for stop and gee for go. And that's where the name came from, at least by my lights. But were they referred to as hoagies on the Morris Canal, Tim?
No, in New Jersey, the term hoagie refers to a sandwich, like a sub, and there's a big fight over whether you call them subs or hoagies. I've never heard the term used in reference to a mule driver.
And Rod, what about your neck of the woods?
No, I'm not familiar with it in our neck of the woods either.
So presumably it was just the Erie and the D&H. The D&H, they're hoagies. That's spelled Hoggee, by the way. Ho and gee, basically.
Yes, this is just a roaring debate here in New York, I guess. So interesting.
New York likes to be the first in lots of things and to be unique. So it's not a surprise that we have our own term for the mule drivers.
And we, of course, love to be litigious about things
There you go.
So with all that said, thanks, Bill, Tim, and Ron for participating here. Thank you everyone for joining us. So yesterday, I got, we had reached out to from another canal, the Virginia Canals and Navigation Society, sent me these interesting images of some locks there. Seems like this was a success, so hopefully keep your eye out in the future for additional collaborations like this. We were talking before this started about how due to the pandemic, and our increased kind of internet literacy, if you will, we're able to have things like this, which would have been almost unthinkable like 3 years ago. So keep your eye out for more sort of interesting infrastructure things. Oh, I'm seeing Pennsylvania canals. Yeah, we got canals all over the country. So we're going to have a lot of conversations like this in the future. So be sure to follow us on social media. I'm sure everyone has their own ones. And I think we all have e-newsletters as well that are very helpful in spreading news. So all that said, support your local canal society. Thanks everyone again.
Thank you, Derek, for hosting this.
Yes,
Yeah.
happy holidays, everyone.
Yes.
And
A pleasure to share the stage with you fine gentlemen.
Thank you.
feelings mutual.
Yes. All right. And I got to figure out how to get out of here. There we go. All right. Take care, everyone. Happy holidays.
Bye.
Happy holidays.